Eliza Crane stood on the porch of the house she had been born in and watched her stepmother count out 12 silver dollars onto the rail. The coins caught the morning light, bright and cold, the exact color of Dorothea's eyes. "That's 3 months of Christian charity," Dorothea said, her voice carrying the particular sweetness she used when she wanted something to sound kind while being cruel. "More than most would offer a girl in your situation. Take it and find lodging in town. I'm sure the boarding house has room for someone willing to work." Eliza looked at the coins but didn't touch them. Behind her, the farm spread out in the early summer haze, 160 acres that her grandfather had cleared and her father had worked until the day he died. The fields were already going to seed. Dorothea hadn't planted anything this year. She hadn't even hired help for the hay. "This is my home," Eliza said. Dorothea's smile didn't waver. "This is my home now, dear. Your father's will was very clear. Everything to his wife. I'm sure he meant for me to care for you, but the law doesn't require it. And frankly, I don't have the resources to feed another mouth while I'm trying to sell this place." "Sell it?" "Mr. Aldrich from St. Louis has expressed interest. The limestone in that bluff is apparently quite valuable for building. He's offered a fair price, and once the sale goes through, I'll be moving somewhere more civilized." Dorothea pushed the coins closer to the rail's edge. "Take the money, Eliza. It's the last you'll get from me." Eliza picked up the coins because she had no choice. She was 17 years old, female, and alone in a world that had very specific ideas about what happened to girls in that situation. She could take the money and find work as a domestic servant, or she could refuse it and starve with her pride intact. She took the money, but she didn't go to town. Old Samuel found her 3 days later, camped in the limestone overhang at the base of the bluff, the same shallow cave where they had sheltered from storms when she was a child, helping her father with the haying. Samuel was 63 years old, a man who had spent the first 40 years of his life as property and the last 23 as the closest thing the Crane farm had to a permanent hand. Dorothea had let him go the day after the funeral, paying him nothing for his final month of work. He stood at the edge of the overhang and looked at Eliza's small camp, the bedroll spread on the stone floor, the fire ring built from creek rocks, the iron pot hanging from a tripod she had fashioned from branches. "She put you out," Samuel said. It wasn't a question. Eliza nodded. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving across the limestone walls of the overhang, up to where the bluff rose another 40 feet above them. Then he pointed to a dark crack in the rock face, maybe 15 feet up the slope. "You see that opening there?" Eliza looked. The crack was barely visible, a shadow in the weathered stone. "That's where the bees live," Samuel said. "Wild colony been in there since before your grandfather cleared this land. Your daddy used to take a few combs every fall, always left enough for them to winter on. Sweetest honey I ever tasted. The cold of that rock keeps them calm, keeps the honey from going runny in the summer heat." Eliza had eaten that honey her whole life. She had never thought about where it came from. "Why are you telling me this?" Samuel looked at her with eyes that had seen more than she could imagine. "Because that woman is going to sell this land to a man who wants to blast it apart for road gravel. Because once that happens, the bees will be gone, the cave will be gone, and everything your family built will be a hole in the ground." He paused. "And because bees remember kindness, if you're gentle with them, they'll make you rich." He turned and walked away without another word. Eliza watched him go, then looked up at the dark crack in the limestone. She had $12, a bedroll, and nowhere else to be. She started climbing. Stay with me, because the way she turned that crack in a rock into a business that bought back her family's farm is one of the most remarkable stories of the frontier. The crack in the limestone was the entrance to something larger. Eliza discovered this on her second day of exploration, when she squeezed through the narrow opening with a candle in her hand and found herself in a chamber roughly 10 feet wide and 8 feet deep. The walls were natural limestone, smooth in some places and rough in others, and the ceiling was high enough for her to stand. The air was cool, maybe 55 degrees, and utterly still. The bees had built their colony against the back wall, a massive structure of wax comb that hung from the ceiling and descended nearly to the floor. The combs were old, some of them clearly decades in the making, and they hummed with the quiet industry of thousands of workers. The bees ignored Eliza entirely. They had no reason to fear a girl standing quietly in the dark. She spent a week learning the colony. She watched the workers come and go through the crack entrance. She noted how they fanned their wings to keep the air moving, how they clustered on the combs in patterns that seemed random, but clearly weren't. She observed that the cool temperature of the cave kept the honey thick and perfect, never crystallizing in winter or running thin in summer. She also noticed that the chamber had room for more, much more. The wild colony occupied perhaps a quarter of the available space. The rest was empty stone, waiting. Eliza had no money for proper hives. What she had was time, desperation, and access to materials that nobody else wanted. She started by scavenging fallen timber from the woods, selecting logs that were hollow or rotted in the center. She cleaned them out, cut them into sections roughly 2 feet long, and fitted them with rough top bars made from split oak. These weren't the elegant box hives she had seen in catalogs. They were skeps, the oldest form of beekeeping, adapted for her specific situation. She placed the first log hive in the cave chamber in early July, positioning it near the wild colony, but not too close. Then she waited. Bees swarm when their colony grows too large for its space. The old queen leaves with half the workers to find a new home, leaving a new queen behind to continue the original colony. Eliza had watched her father catch swarms before, though she had never done it herself. She knew that a swarm was looking for shelter, and that the cool, dark cave would be exactly what they wanted. The first swarm moved into her log hive on July 19th. The second came on August 3rd. By the end of the summer, Eliza had 4 established colonies in the cave chamber, plus the original wild colony that had been there all along. She didn't harvest anything that first year. She let the bees build, let them fill their combs, let them store enough honey to survive the winter. She lived on the $12 Dorothea had given her, stretching each coin until it screamed, eating wild greens and the few vegetables she managed to grow in a small garden she planted near the overhang. Dorothea saw her occasionally when Eliza came down to the creek that ran through what was still technically her stepmother's property. The older woman never spoke to her. She simply watched with those cold blue eyes, then returned to the farmhouse that stood empty except for one bitter widow, waiting for a sale that kept falling through. Mr. Aldrich came twice that summer, once in June and once in September. Each time, he walked the property with Dorothea, pointing at the limestone bluff, discussing tonnage and extraction costs. Each time, he left without signing anything. The price wasn't right. The access roads would cost too much. There was always a reason to delay. Eliza watched these visits from her position on the bluff, hidden in the brush above the cave entrance. She watched the man who wanted to dynamite her bees into oblivion shake hands with the woman who had stolen her home, and she felt something cold and patient settle into her chest. She would get it back, all of it, and she would do it with honey. The first harvest came in April of 1892, after the bees had survived the winter and begun their spring buildup. Eliza had learned through trial and error how to work the colonies without protective equipment, moving slowly, breathing calmly, never swatting or panicking when a bee landed on her skin. She had been stung perhaps 200 times in the past year, and each sting had taught her something about what the bees would and wouldn't tolerate. She harvested 12 pounds of honey from her 4-log hives, leaving the wild colony untouched as Samuel had taught her. The honey was extraordinary, dark amber with a flavor that tasted like the wildflowers of the Ozark Hills, nothing like the pale, bland honey sold in stores. She poured it into mason jars she had bought with her last dollar and carried them to town. The general store owner offered her 40 cents a pound, the same price he paid for commercial honey shipped from Kansas City. Eliza looked at him, then at the bland jars on his shelf, and walked out without selling a single jar. She went to the hotel instead. The Ozark Springs Hotel catered to visitors from St. Louis who came to take the waters and escape the summer heat. They paid premium prices for premium goods. Eliza found the kitchen entrance and asked to speak to the cook. Mrs. Patterson was a large woman with a skeptical eye and a talent for detecting fraud. She looked at Eliza's homespun dress and bare feet, then at the jar of dark honey in her hand. "What makes you think your honey is worth more than store-bought?" Eliza opened the jar and held it out. "Taste it." Mrs. Patterson dipped a spoon, brought it to her lips, and stopped chewing her tobacco mid-motion. Her eyes widened slightly. She took another taste, then a third. "Where did you get this?" "I made it. The bees made it, from the limestone caves up on the Crane property." "The Crane property." Mrs. Patterson's eyes narrowed. "I heard about you. The girl Dorothea Crane put out after the funeral, living wild in the hills like some kind of hermit." "I'm not wild. I'm working." Mrs. Patterson looked at the jar again. "I'll give you $2 a pound. Bring me as much as you can, as often as you can. My guests will pay 3 times that for honey like this on their breakfast biscuits." Eliza sold all 12 pounds that morning. She walked back to her cave with $24 in her pocket, more money than she had held since her father died. She used it to buy more log sections, more jars, and enough provisions to last through the summer without foraging. She expanded the cave chamber by another 6 feet, chipping away at the soft limestone with a hammer and chisel she had salvaged from her father's abandoned workshop. By September, she had 12 colonies producing. By the following April, she had 20. The math was simple. Each colony produced roughly 20 pounds of harvestable honey per year once established. At $2 a pound, 20 colonies meant $400 annual income. That was more than most farmhands earned in a year. That was more than the Crane farm had cleared in profit in any year Eliza could remember. By 1893, the hotel was buying everything she could produce and still asking for more. Mrs. Patterson had started calling it cave honey and charging guests 50 cents for a small pot at breakfast. The reputation spread to other hotels, then to restaurants in Springfield, then to a specialty grocer in St. Louis who wrote Eliza a letter asking if she could supply 20 pounds a month year-round. She built a second chamber in the cave that year, connecting it to the first by a narrow tunnel she carved by hand. She lined the walls with whitewashed boards to reflect her lantern light and built proper shelving for her hives. The temperature stayed constant at 54 degrees regardless of season, which meant her honey never granulated in winter or fermented in summer. It stayed perfect in the jar, exactly as it came from the comb. The bees thrived in the darkness. They had no weather to contend with, no predators to fight, no sudden temperature swings to disrupt their cycles. They built comb faster and stored honey more efficiently than any surface hives could match. The cave was their ideal environment, and Eliza had given it to them. Mr. Aldrich returned in the fall of 1893, but this time he didn't come alone. He brought a lawyer, a surveyor, and an offer of $800 for the entire property. Dorothea accepted immediately. The papers were to be signed by the end of the month. Eliza learned about the sale from Mrs. Patterson, who had heard about it from a guest who had heard about it from Aldrich himself. She had perhaps 3 weeks before the bluff she had turned into a honey empire was blasted apart for gravel. She went to the bank. The banker was a man named Whitmore, elderly and skeptical of anything that didn't come through normal channels. He listened to Eliza's proposal with the patience of a man who had heard many desperate pitches and turned down most of them. "You want to buy the Crane property out from under a signed purchase agreement. The papers aren't signed yet. Mrs. Crane hasn't received payment. I can match Aldrich's offer." Whitmore raised an eyebrow. "You have $800? "I have $400 in cash and documented sales receipts showing $600 in annual income from my honey operation. The hotel will sign a contract guaranteeing purchase for the next 3 years. That's collateral worth more than the property itself." She laid out the receipts, the letters from Mrs. Patterson, the record she had kept in a careful hand since her first sale. She showed him the math. 28 colonies producing 560 pounds of honey per year. Wholesale value over $1,100 at current prices, with room to expand to 50 colonies within 2 years. Whitmore studied the documents for a long time. Then he looked at the girl in front of him, the 17-year-old who had been thrown out of her own home and had built a business out of bees and spite. "The property is worth more to Aldrich than $800, he said slowly. "The limestone deposits alone are worth 10 times that if properly quarried." "Then let him find another limestone bluff. This one has my bees in it." Something flickered in Whitmore's face that might have been admiration. "I'll need Mrs. Crane's agreement to break the sale, and she'll need a reason to accept your offer over Aldrich's." Eliza smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "I'll give her a reason." The confrontation happened on the porch of the farmhouse where Eliza had been born, the same porch where Dorothea had counted out 12 silver dollars 3 years earlier. This time, it was Eliza who held the papers. "You can't afford this property," Dorothea said, her composure cracking for the first time since Eliza had known her. "You're a child living in a cave. Where would you get $800? From the bees you tried to sell to a man who would have destroyed them. From the honey I've been selling while you sat in this empty house waiting for someone to rescue you." Eliza set the bank draft on the porch rail. $800. Match Aldrich's offer exactly. Plus, I'll cover the legal fees for breaking the existing agreement. "And if I refuse?" "Then I'll tell Mr. Aldrich exactly why his limestone operation will fail. I'll tell him about the cave system that runs through that bluff, the chambers and tunnels that make the stone unsuitable for quarrying. I'll tell him that the first blast will collapse the entire face and bury his equipment. He's a businessman, Dorothea. He'll have the property surveyed, and when he finds out I'm right, he'll walk away, and you'll be left with a farm you can't sell and debts you can't pay." Dorothea's face went pale. "You're bluffing. I've spent 3 years inside that bluff. I know every crack, every chamber, every weakness in the stone. I'm not bluffing." The silence stretched between them, filled with 3 years of cold nights and hard work, and the particular satisfaction of watching someone who had thrown you away realize they had thrown away the wrong person. Dorothea took the bank draft. The deed was transferred on November 3rd, 1893. Eliza walked through the farmhouse she had been born in, through rooms that smelled of dust and abandonment, and began making a list of repairs. The fields would need replowing. The barn needed a new roof. The well needed cleaning. But first, she walked up to the bluff and sat at the entrance of her cave, listening to the hum of 28 colonies working in the darkness below. She was 19 years old, the owner of 160 acres, and the sole proprietor of a honey business that would grow to be the largest in the Ozarks within the next decade. She never saw Dorothea again. Her stepmother took the $800 and moved to Kansas City, where she reportedly married a merchant who went bankrupt within the year. Mr. Aldrich found another limestone deposit 10 miles north and built his quarry there, never knowing how close he had come to owning the most productive honey cave in Missouri. Old Samuel came back the following spring. He found Eliza whitewashing the farmhouse, the windows open for the first time in years, the fields already planted with clover that would feed her bees through the summer. "Heard you bought the place back," he said, leaning on the fence. "I had help," Eliza replied. "Someone showed me where the bees lived." Samuel smiled, a rare expression that transformed his weathered face. "Bees remember kindness. Looks like you do too." He worked the Crane farm for another 12 years until his body finally gave out in 1905. Eliza buried him on the hill behind the house, next to her father and her grandfather, with a headstone that read, "He showed me where the honey was." The Crane Honey Company operated until 1943, when Eliza's granddaughter finally closed the cave operation and converted to modern surface hives. By then, the business had produced over 250,000 pounds of cave honey, sold to hotels and restaurants across 3 states. The original cave chamber still exists, though it's no longer used for beekeeping. The limestone walls still bear the marks of Eliza's chisel, and on quiet days, visitors claim they can still hear the hum of bees in the darkness. The Historical Society in Springfield has a small exhibit about Eliza Crane, including her original sales ledger and one of the log hives she built during that first desperate summer. The placard calls her a pioneer of Missouri apiculture, which is a formal way of saying she was a 17-year-old girl who got thrown out of her home and decided to build an empire out of spite and bees. The farm is still in the family. The bluff is still there, protected now by a conservation easement that prevents any quarrying or development. The wild colony that Samuel showed Eliza in 1891 is still producing, over 130 years of continuous occupation, the longest documented wild bee colony in the state. Some stories end with the heroine forgiving those who wronged her. This isn't one of them. Eliza never forgave Dorothea, never spoke to her again, never even mentioned her name in the diary she kept for 60 years. What she did instead was more powerful than forgiveness. She succeeded so completely that Dorothea became irrelevant, a footnote in the story of a woman who turned abandonment into ownership, one jar of honey at a time. If this story of sweet revenge resonated with you, consider subscribing for more narratives of forgotten triumph. What is the cave in your life that everyone else has overlooked? And what would happen if you filled it with something that could make you rich?